I first met Bruce Gagnon 4 years ago at a statewide meeting for activists here in the state of Maine. Someone told me I should meet him because we had a lot in common. So I approached him during a break and said, "Hey, we should get together sometime." Well, he didn't seem too interested, but I persisted later on and eventually we met for coffee. And that has led to a deep personal relationship. Bruce Gagnon began his activism as soon as he got out of the military. He began working with the farm workers in Florida and later went on to work in community issues around social justice. Later, he founded the Global Network. Bruce Gagnon has traveled the world. He's traveled across the United States numerous times, giving talks and interacting with people in the hopes that he could educate them about what is really happening in this country and around the world. Bruce has an ability to articulate the big picture and to connect the dots in language that anybody can understand. Bruce Gagnon organizes everything from peace walks to protests to weekly visuals at Bath Iron Works. Bruce Gagnon is a tireless activist for peace. I'm happy and proud to share his story with you.
My name is Bruce Gagnon. I live in Bath, Maine, and I'm a member of Maine Veterans for Peace. My stepfather was in the Air Force, and from when I was about 3 years old, we began moving around the country and into Germany twice and England as well, living in the United States and Florida and California, South Dakota. So every 2 or 3 years we moved to a different military base. And so I got many influences from these various cultures that I lived in. And I saw the perspective of many people, like in England and Germany. I got a different sense about how people view America and about how they viewed the military. Particularly in Germany, I got that sense. So early on, those were formative influences on me, I think. In 1968, we were living up in the panhandle of Florida, so conservative up there in Fort Walton Beach that they call it Lower Alabama. My dad was stationed at Eglin Air Force Base. And there I was a vice chair of the Okaloosa County, Florida Young Republican Club, working on the Nixon campaign. And then my senior year of high school, we moved to Northern California. And just after high school, I went to my induction physical in Oakland, California, which was really one of the most memorable anti-war experiences I ever had. They told us to get there early in the morning before the place even opened. And there was a long line of people outside. Mostly there were people that had been drafted. I had not yet received my draft notice, but I was trying to join to go into the military. And there were two people working the line that day. One was a mother who was weeping and pleading in very, very strong emotional terms, pleading with us not to join the military. Her son had been killed in Vietnam. And then behind her, there was a black man working the line. He had no face. His face was burnt and scarred. He had no nose, no ears, and he just had holes in his face. And he was saying that he had been to Vietnam and was pleading with us not to join the military. So this really was a tremendously emotional experience for me, just as I was trying to join the military. Most of these people in line were drafted. They didn't want to go in the military. And then once I got inside, I took my physical. I flunked my physical because of an old high school football injury. And so they sent me on a bus from Oakland over to the Presidio in San Francisco to see the head surgeon because I had to get a waiver to get into the military. And everybody else on this bus were seeking waivers to stay out. And I remember sitting next to this young guy that was claiming he had flat feet and couldn't go in the military. He ended up being rejected, was drafted, and then I received my waiver and was then inducted into the Air Force at that time. After my training, basic training and my job training, I was sent to Travis Air Force Base in California. There was an airlift base for the war in Vietnam. And so soldiers would come from all over the country to our base, fly to Vietnam, and when the transport planes would return, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers lined up on the runway just across the street from where I worked almost on a daily basis. They'd also bring the walking wounded back with them as well. And so there were a lot of protests outside our gate, and they would come around to us at our different places of work and threaten us and say, don't you dare go to these protests. We're going to have the Office of Secret Investigation, the OSI, out there taking pictures. And if anybody is caught out there, you could be court-martialed. And then we would also be talking about this in the barracks as well. And as it turned out, on my first day checking into this base at Travis Air Force Base, when I checked into what they called the orderly room, they looked down this clipboard and the guy said, "Oh my God, man, I'm sorry, we've only got one room left. I'm really sorry. Get your bags, follow me." And we walked down this long, dark hallway, last door on the left, and he kept apologizing. And I'm thinking that they're going to put me in some little broom closet with a cot. And he opens the door and we walk in, and there are anti-war posters all over the wall. And as it turns out, this was the room of one of the leading organizers in the GI resistance movement on our base. And they were keeping him isolated because they wanted to kick him out, but they didn't have enough stuff on him yet. And then they forgot about me. And so over a period of time, several nights a week, there'd be a knock on the door. And one night, white guys would come in with chairs and sit in a circle talking about the war, talking about U.S. imperialism. I'm sitting in a corner thinking, oh my God, who are these people? They must be commies or something. Another night there was a knock on the door, and there were black guys with chairs, Black Panthers from the cities, talking about racism in America, racism in the military. And again, I'm sitting in the corner. So this really was an education for me, because I essentially grew up behind the barbed wire fences on the military bases around the world. And so we would be discussing the war all the time, in the barracks at night, on the job, arguing with our bosses. When there were protests outside, that would really get us going too. And this is one reason why I'm a huge believer in protests at military bases. People often feel, I can just imagine that usually there were a small number of people outside our base, maybe 7, 8, 9, or 10, or 11, standing there with signs. And I can just imagine what they're saying to each other. Do you think it does any good? Do you think we're ever going to stop this war? Do you think any of these GIs inside are paying attention? And little did they know that they were driving the 15,000 permanently stationed people on our base to constantly be in a state of essentially conflict over this war. So you can't necessarily quantify and qualify what the presence at a military base does, but just from my own life, I know that it really helps unleash a dynamic that brings people to change, and that's really what happened to me. So within about 6 months, I determined, my chair moved into the circle after a short time, and I determined that I too was against the war, and actually asked to be let out as a conscientious objector during one of my what they called career counseling sessions. But they asked me this question: what's your family history? Do you come from a traditional peace church, Quakers, Mennonite, Church of the Brethren? And my response was no. Actually, I came from a military family. I was a young Republican for Nixon in '68. So that they turned me down, and I didn't really know enough to do anything beyond that. So I did 3.5 years of what I called hard time in the military. One of the more formative experiences for me was one day during my lunch break. I was at the base exchange looking at the book rack, and there I found the Pentagon Papers. I'd been reading about it in the newspaper, the secret government history, about the pretext to go into Vietnam, the history of how the government lied to the American people, to the Congress, to the media, setting up the whole justification for going into Vietnam. And here was this document that Daniel Ellsberg, at that time working at the Rand Corporation, he was a Marine officer, he had been to Vietnam, he had come back very skeptical about the war, and now he's helping to write this secret internal history. But his conscience was bothering him, and so he smuggled out 7,000 pages of this document at night, going to a local copy store on these old, slow copy machines, anticipating that any moment the FBI was going to crash through the door and arrest him. But he was successful in copying it, getting it to various newspapers across the country, and it was ultimately published as a book. And this book, The Pentagon Papers, really finished off any remaining illusions I had about our government. It really destroyed the remaining small fabric of so-called patriotism that I had about, for our country. And no longer did I believe any of it, any of the lies, any of the official story. And my life since then has only confirmed the truth of the Pentagon Papers and this long, sordid, ugly history of U.S. foreign policy. In 1974, I got out of the Air Force and I moved to Florida and was going to college, eventually just near graduation at the University of Florida in Gainesville. And I got recruited by the United Farm Workers Union to become an organizer of fruit pickers. And so I was sent to California for training for a month at the UFW headquarters, and then returned to Florida, where I was a field office director in Apopka and Winter Garden, Florida, organizing people who pick fruit, mostly black, Hispanic, Jamaican workers who were picking fruit in Florida. And then from there I went on to work in urban social justice issues, job training, low-income housing, public transportation, gentrification of the black community. Worked on these kind of issues for several years. And then by the end of the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter, who I voted for because he said that the arms race was a disgrace to the human race, and then when he became president, he built the huge nuclear submarine, Trident submarine base in St. Mary's, Georgia, betraying that very statement of his. And that's when I really began to give up on the Democratic Party as an institution of reform and as a so-called progressive party. But at the end of Carter administration and the beginning of Reagan administration, they were cutting back on social programs and dramatically increasing the military budget, all aimed at the former Soviet Union. And so at that time, in 1983, I went to work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, where I worked for 15 years. And in that job, because we were so close to the Space Center, just an hour away, I lived in Orlando at that time, so we were so close to Cape Canaveral Kennedy Space Center, I began paying a lot of attention to the space program. In fact, in 1983, on June 12th, June 12th, 1982. So on June 12th, 1982, there was a almost million-person march in New York City around the United Nations Special Session on Disarmament, trying to get rid of the nuclear weapons from all sides. And I didn't go to the protest, but I was watching television that day. I was watching C-SPAN, and they were covering the protest, the rally, the speakers. And after it was over, they cut away to a right-wing conference. And the speaker at that conference was Reagan's head of Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Lieutenant General Graham. And during the question and answer period after Graham's speech, somebody said, General Graham, aren't you worried about that big protest? They say almost 1 million people in New York City today. He said, no, I think it's fantastic. They're out there protesting against ICBMs, nuclear weapons, and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing. And so in that moment, June 12, 1982, I began to focus on space so that when I went to work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice in 1983, where I worked for 15 years, I began taking people over and over again to the Space Center as we began to protest military satellite launches of Trident missiles, Trident nuclear missiles, test firing them, and then ultimately the several launches of plutonium on board NASA missions to outer space. So in 1998, I left the Florida Coalition to work full-time on space issues with the global network, and I began traveling 2 to 3 weeks out of every month for several years, both around the United States and around the world, making connection with people in communities that had some manifestation of this space nuclearization and weaponization program. So as it turns out, as satellites orbit the Earth, they beam their signal down to the Earth below. So the U.S. Space Command has essentially set up downlink receiving stations around the planet in places like Australia and northern England, Greenland, Japan, Germany, many other places, so that the satellites, military satellites, beam information down to those downlink stations that then relays it via other satellites back to the United States. So in these communities, in these various countries, there are peace groups who say, we don't want our country to be part of the U.S. Star Wars program. And so that became the natural constituency for the global network. They became the leadership of our organization. So the Pentagon has been saying for some time that Star Wars, militarization, weaponization of space, will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth, necessitating so much money that they can't have enough, even with the massive Pentagon budget that they have today. And so two things they're doing. One is they're buying Congress more than ever to ensure this pipeline, this uninterrupted pipeline of federal tax dollars moving into the aerospace industry, because there's so much profit to be made. Every time you launch a rocket with a satellite on it, satellite costs a couple $100 million, the rocket costs a couple $100 million. They blow up on occasion, they have to start all over again. It's just a massive black hole. So in one industry publication called Space News some years ago, they ran an editorial saying, we've got to be responsible corporate citizens. We've got to come up with a dedicated funding source for this weaponization of space. And they said, we have, and it's the entitlement program. So we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure those that officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program. So those are the social programs that the military-industrial complex has identified for defunding in order to pay for this space warfare system. So every year then, for the last 23 years, the global network has an annual meeting in a different country. Last year we met in California at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The year before we met up in northern Sweden that is being turned into a U.S. NATO drone testing and satellite receiving area. So a key part of this whole warfare infrastructure system being built up there in northern Sweden. Even Swedish people know very little about it. So we go to these places in order to shine a light on what's happening. This year in 2015, we'll be going to Kyoto, Japan, where the United States is putting a missile defense radar in Kyoto Prefecture that is going to be aimed at China, helping the U.S. be able to deliver first strike attack with its so-called missile defense system on China. So at each of these meetings, we help share information with each other, the various leaders from various communities around the world. We begin to have a better, more cohesive picture of what's going on in the overall space infrastructure, warfare infrastructure system. And then we also help educate local populations about their particular role in this larger picture. And this is the way we've begun to expand the global network and expand the consciousness of literally the peace movement, because most people, even in the peace movement, don't yet understand how this whole thing works. You know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the former Soviet Union, former U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker, under the first Daddy Bush administration, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch toward the east into the former Soviet bloc. Because, you know, Russia's been invaded repeatedly by the West, and that's their big fear. That's why they had this big kind of safety system with the Warsaw Pact there during the Cold War. But then Clinton became president, and he broke this promise by continually expanding NATO towards Russia. And then today we see NATO with bases in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, right on the Russian border. They're trying to get into Finland, to Ukraine, and to Georgia, again, right on the Russian border. And so Russia is literally freaking out. I mean, it's the equivalent of Russia or China building military bases in Mexico or Canada. I mean, we'd go ballistic over that. But when we do it to the other side, it's okay, and the American people don't really know about it anyway. So, but this whole thing is coupled, this NATO expansion is coupled with U.S. missile defense deployments. Now, missile defense is a key element in U.S. first strike strategy. The idea is you try to, in a first strike, take out Russian or Chinese nuclear missiles, but you don't get all of them. So then they fire their retaliatory capability. And it's that point where you have missile defense systems on land and on these destroyers, Aegis destroyers made at Bath Iron Works, here where I live in Maine. They then fire these interceptor missiles, take out that Russian or Chinese retaliatory strike, giving the U.S. a quote-unquote successful first strike attack. Well, these deployments surrounding Russia and China today by the U.S. are freaking out those two countries. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, we can't continue to negotiate nuclear arms reductions with you as you're expanding missile defense. In fact, when George W. Bush first became president, he pulled the U.S. out of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty that outlawed the development, testing, and deployment of these very missile defense systems, because both sides knew they were destabilizing. They would give one side an advantage over the other. And the idea was that's how you, by having this treaty, ABM treaty, this is how you have some stability. Well, the U.S. has now walked away from that, is increasing our missile defense deployments surrounding Russia and China, and tensions are growing. At the same time, we've created this civil war, we meaning the United States. I shouldn't use the word we again. The United States has created this civil war inside Ukraine, right on Russia's border. Why? To destabilize Russia, because the end goal is to take them down, to balkanize Russia, regime change in Moscow, just like the U.S. has done in so many other places, like Libya, like we're trying to do in Syria, like we've done, like we're trying to do in Iran as well. So regime change in Moscow, and ultimately China is the goal of the U.S. and NATO. So the ultimate goal here is full spectrum dominance, full control of the global economy, and most importantly, full control of declining global resources. If you're not part of the capitalist team, you're going to be taken down. The United States has determined that Russia and China and other countries outside of their immediate control, like Iran, Venezuela, must be taken down. And so this is what the agenda is today. The Pentagon has essentially become the primary resource extraction service for corporate globalization. So as it turns out, Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas and significant supplies of oil. Guess who wants to get their hands on that? Just like we did with Libya. Libya has the largest supply of oil on the African continent. So Gaddafi was taken down by US and NATO. So that's the agenda. That's what Ukraine is all about. Anybody that stands up to the US will be taken down. At the same time, because of climate change, the Arctic Ocean ice is melting. In fact, recently, our Senator Angus King from Maine went on a U.S. nuclear submarine ride along with New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. He wrote about it in the New York Times in his column. And they were looking at the glories of possible resource extraction of oil and natural gas from the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. But what country has the largest land border with the Arctic? Well, as it turns out, it's Russia. So I would submit that a key strategy here of the U.S., of this encirclement of Russia, of this civil war in Ukraine, of this goal of balkanization of Russia, is also to get at unimpeded access at that Arctic oil and natural gas as the ice melts. You know, Russia and China and other countries have created this new organization called BRICS. Stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they're creating essentially an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank, an alternative economic structure that other countries would be able to turn to for loans that wouldn't be exploited the way the IMF and the World Bank do today. For example, today Ukraine has a new finance minister that is actually an American woman born in Chicago, very corrupt history in high finance. She was put in as head of Ukraine's finance ministry, and on the same day made a Ukrainian citizen. So as Ukraine is being hollowed out so that Monsanto can move there to do GMO farming, they want to do fracking in the eastern part of Ukraine where the civil war is happening today along Russia's border. So IMF wants control of Ukraine, and they'll do anything to get it. Well, so the BRICS and Russia and China and these other countries are starting to say, we're creating an alternative. Well, this is unacceptable to the West, to the US and the British and Brussels, the EU and NATO. They're going to do everything they can to make sure that this doesn't happen. And they're going to do everything they can to disrupt internally both Russia and China to stop this kind of alternative multipolar world rather than this unipolar US-EU world. So the real danger here is that this could eventually bleed into a larger war. What happens when the Ukraine project falls apart? What is the US and NATO going to do then? They're already sending hundreds of American military advisors into Ukraine. What happens if some of those guys get killed? Is that then a pretext to allow for US bombing of the self-defense forces in eastern Ukraine, which one would then draw Russia into the war? I believe that the United States clearly wants to draw Russia into an active shooting war. They've been claiming that Russia has invaded Ukraine. There's no evidence of that. But the goal clearly is to draw them into a war. At the same time, they're trying to do the same thing to China. First with Hong Kong, destabilization of Hong Kong. It turns out that the so-called umbrella revolution in Hong Kong is being supported by the CIA, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and George Soros money. So the US is funding this. A lot of the so-called leaders
are sort of Wall Street types in Hong Kong. You know, these are not your normal activists. You know, so clearly the goal is to, at the same time, create destabilization inside of China and begin to disrupt that country and break that apart as well. What I do is I work locally, I work statewide, and I work nationally and internationally, really all at the same time. In my community, we have Bath Iron Works that are building these Aegis destroyers that are going to be ported throughout the Asia Pacific as part of Obama's pivot of U.S. military forces into that region. That means they're going to be going into this new Navy base on Jeju Island in South Korea that the U.S. has twisted the arm of the South Korean government. Years ago, I called the South Korean embassy in Washington to say, stop building this Navy base there. And the woman on the phone said to me, why are you calling us? Call your own government. They're twisting our arm, forcing us to build this thing. And so while the U.S. never acknowledges it, the truth of the matter is that this beautiful 500-year-old fishing and farming community is being devastated, torn apart at the bequest of the United States because they need more ports of call. They need more barracks. They need more airfields for this pivot into the Asia Pacific. So places like Jeju Island, places like Guam, Okinawa, and other such sites around the Asian Pacific are seeing a tremendous ramping up and escalation of U.S. military facilities in order to host this military encirclement that is coming to surround China in that region. I've been to Gagnon village 3 times, and every time I go there, I am deeply, deeply affected by the incredible spirit of the people, their connection to nature, their understanding about our relationship to nature, that we humans are part of nature, and that as we destroy nature, we literally destroy ourselves. But my last time I went there, the fence was being built around the area. The barbed wire was at that time placed along the rocks of Gurumbi. We went out on kayaks to try to get onto the rocks. We crawled under the razor wire and were arrested and taken to jail. For me, Jeju Island is, and particularly Gagnon Village, this 500-year-old fishing and farming community, is an important symbol for the peace movement all over the world. The reason is because everything comes together here. This new growing conflict between the United States and China, and in fact Russia too, because Russia borders North Korea. It's part of that whole region as well. The environmental degradation that's going to come from this Navy base on Jeju, and the whole human rights issue as the people's movement there is suppressed, as the military boot comes down on their neck to try to stop their efforts to resist and defend their way of life. So for the peace movement all over the world, I think this fight on Jeju Island is fundamental. Also, in my own state, I organize peace walks, organize meetings, lectures, all different kind of events in order to help illuminate this issue. I'd like people in my community to see how this Bath Iron Works plays a key role in this aggressive U.S. military foreign policy. Most people, even in the peace movement in Maine, aren't that aware of where these Navy destroyers that are made in Bath actually go when they leave our community. They really don't think about it. They don't want to think about it. And so I'm continually trying to help make those links, connect those dots so that people begin to understand how our community plays a key role in this aggressive U.S. Military policy. Over the years, we've organized several peace walks through Maine, and the goal is really to bring these issues to the people of the state, to get the people in our state to begin to see how our economy is becoming corrupted. It's becoming addicted to military production, to military spending, like so many other communities across the country, because it's really the only investment dollars anymore that are available to local communities from the national government.
And so you have the Democrats, the Republicans together on their bended knees begging for more funds from the Pentagon because they know it's the only game in town. So we're trying to create consciousness, debate, and movement in our state with these walks to help people really come alive around this issue. Because in order to pay for all of these systems, these military systems, the U.S. has to keep cutting social progress. They have to cut education. They have to cut health care. They have to cut mental health programs, roads and bridges, sewer and water systems. I just read recently that New Jersey has just voted to privatize their water system, ostensibly because the state and local communities don't have the money to repair them anymore. So now they're going to sell them to investors who are going to rip them off and control people's water and make more money on it, more profit. So these are the kind of things that we're seeing happen because of this full concentration of control on our tax dollars by the military, excuse me, by the military-industrial complex. So what's really at stake today is freedom and democracy, all the things that I was as a young boy, growing up on the military bases behind the barbed wire fences, educated in the schools on these Air Force bases, all these things that were inculcated into my consciousness that I was, believed in as a young patriotic American. But now I've learned, of course, that they're all lies. And we have this corporate domination of our Congress, of our media, of every avenue of dissent, the courts. Everything is blocked now. And so when you think about it, it's like Mussolini, in World War II in Italy. The Italian leader defined fascism as the wedding of corporations and government. Well, clearly this is what we have today. It's what Bertram Gross in the book Friendly Fascism called three-piece suit fascism. It's a little different from Hitler's brown shirts, but it's still fascism. Since 9/11, there's just been a succession of laws, the Patriot Act, and a host of others, that really have begun to outlaw free expression, democracy. I mean, look what the NSA is doing today, spying on all of us. So this is, I think, clear evidence to all of us, should be anyway, that they've essentially eviscerated the Constitution of the United States, and that we now have this corporate fascism in America. So, where do I turn for news anymore, right? I can't go to the New York Times or the Washington Post. I can't pick up my local paper because the Associated Press stories are probably written by a CIA agent. We've just heard the disclosure out of Germany by an editor and longtime journalist with a major German newspaper that he worked for the CIA, and they would hand him a story, he would put his name on it, and that became news. So who can we trust? Well, literally, I go to Democracy Now!, I go to RT, Russia Today, I go to Sputnik, I go to Press TV out of Iran. I'm looking at a whole host of other sources, bloggers all over the world that are giving me local reports about what's really going on. These are the kind of places that you really can get other opinions, a whole nother side of the story these days, because otherwise we don't get anything. We just get this whitewashed, varnished, strung out, wrung out, twisted version of the truth, essentially edited and approved, emphasis on the word approved, by the CIA. What keeps me going all these years now is a couple things, a sense of responsibility, a stubbornness, a wish to hand the future generations a chance of living. I think the most important job of a human being on the earth is to work for the future generations, to keep the fires burning so that my son and other people's children and grandchildren can have a chance to live. Native Americans talked about every decision should be viewed in the context of how it affects the next 7 generations. So that's the way I tend to think. So I find sustenance, I find hope in knowing that I'm very lucky because I work for this global network, and I'm in contact with people all over the world almost daily. And they're working hard in their community. And I realize I don't have to do everything. I don't have to carry the world on my shoulders. I just have to do my bit and stay connected to a larger movement that is now literally global. And if we stay together and work together and share information together, we accelerate our ability to change things. And if we all fail in the end, well, what better way to have spent my life than to work for the people and for our relatives, the animal world, the plant world, the water, the air. The native people said that the sacred hoop was broken because of the way the white man lives on this planet today. And so I always feel in the end my job is to help repair the sacred hoop, to give life a chance. Soon after boot camp, I joined the Air Force in 1971 and during the Vietnam War. And soon after boot camp, I was visiting one of my best friends, and he told me, "Wow, Bruce, you're really different. You've really changed." And I said, "What are you talking about? You're crazy." And it took me some years to really see that, in fact, just that short period of time in that authoritarian system where you have really no right to think for yourself, it had changed me, even though I was conscious of it and I was trying to make sure they didn't take away my soul and my spirit. They had, in fact, changed me. So I think that's a reality of the military, that even when you think that it's not having an effect on you, it does, especially when you're drawn into combat and you go and you participate actively in killing people. Then you are really changed forever.
I can't walk in your boots. I don't know what you've been through, but I once had boots like yours, raised the flag, marched off the war. Had ribbons on my chest, proud soldier, once the best. Had each other, not much more, as we marched off to war. I am sorry for what I did. My God, was just a kid. Mapped the targets, bombs away, death, destruction every day. Can't count the numbers killed, but I know I always will. Carry pain inside for the thousands that have died. I can't walk in your boots. I don't know what you've been through, but I once had boots like yours, raised the flag, marched off to war. Had ribbons on my chest, proud soldier, once the best. Had each other, not much more, as we marched off to war. Now you've come home from war, different than before. Broken body, tortured mind, can't leave the past behind. Memories won't go away, as real as yesterday. Shattered nerves, nightmares, and more. Can't escape from war. I can't walk in your boots. I don't know what you've been through, but I once had boots like yours, raised the flag, marched off to war. Had ribbons on my chest, proud soldier, once the best. Had each other, not much more, as we marched off to war. Over years I have found you and I are bound. Different ages, different war, yet together evermore. I will stand by your side, hold you up, it's safe to cry. You are not alone, young soldier. Welcome home.